1,000 years. 1,000 years of absolute power, untold riches, and utter madness. They ruled half of Europe, sat on mountains of gold, wallowed in the luxury of the most opulent palaces, commanding millions of lives. But their history is no mere parade of triumphs. It was a path where piety gave way to lust, lust to recklessness, and recklessness led to total decadence, dizzying military victories and crushing defeats, intricate court intrigues and blood-stirring love affairs. Mysteries that historians grapple with to this day. How did a dynasty that held half a continent in its grip end up on the scaffold? What caused their downfall? Countless mistresses who squandered the treasury, an insatiable lust for absolute power that brooked no opposition, or the blindness of the monarchs themselves, who refused to see the brewing storm of revolution? Brace yourselves. Today we delve into a world where the glitter of gold mingled with blood and grandeur turned to tragedy. Today, the story of the great House of Bourbon, a dynasty with 1,000-year history, a family whose members controlled virtually half of Europe, drowning in untold wealth, the gleam of gold and the splendor of the most luxurious palaces and gardens. Some were born with a crown on their head, yet never truly got to wear it. Others seemed entirely unprepared for the throne, but by fate's whim commanded millions of human lives. This is the Bourbons, a dynasty that first united a kingdom torn by wars, only to see centuries later how the fire of revolution would once again turn it to ruins. Here, piety gave way to lust, lust to folly, and folly led to total decadence. All this is the embodiment of the great House of Bourbon. Dizzying military triumphs and crushing defeats, intricate court intrigues, blood-stirring love secrets, and mysteries that historians are still grappling with. And of course, the stunning elegance unique to this dynasty. Brace yourselves. Today we plunge into the world of the Bourbons. So, the history of this astonishing lineage dates all the way back to the 10th century. Just think, this dynasty has existed for over 1,000 years. The first lords of Bourbon, known today as the Bourbon Archambault, were humble vassals of the Counts of Bourges, whose lands lay right in the very heart of modern France. Yes, despite later conquests and marriages, our heroes are true French aristocracy. The 10th century in Western Europe was a time when the power of the descendants of Charlemagne, the mighty emperor of the Franks, was already waning. West Francia, the future France, groaned under the rule of a weak monarch, nicknamed Charles the Simple. And it was at this very moment that the first, almost legendary hero of our story steps onto the stage. Adhemar, or Aymar de Souvigny and Bourbonnais, this man was an astonishing mix of piety and shrewd calculation. Adhemar masterfully exploited the colossal resources of the Roman Catholic Church, the most powerful institution in Europe at the time, and in 913 obtained a feudal domain, the Seigneury of Bourbonnais, from Charles the Simple. This event, like a spark, gave a name to the entire future dynasty, a name that would resonate throughout the world. In 915, Adhemar founded the Abbey of Souvigny, and that's where the story of the mysterious founder abruptly ends. But his descendants were no less formidable. In just 4 generations, thanks to shrewd dynastic marriages and local military adventures, they expanded their holdings so much that the head of the line, Archambault VII, managed to marry none other than Agnes of Savoy. Agnes was the daughter of the very emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. Of course, she had no claim to the throne but the prestige, the influence. Such a marriage brought the young Lord of Bourbonnais simply unfathomable dividends. In fact, Archambault became the brother-in-law of the French king Louis VI the Fat himself. However, after such a dazzling ascent, real storm clouds gathered over the House of Bourbon for the first time. The 5th head of the dynasty, Archambault VIII, managed to father only a daughter. Her name was Margot, and under medieval feudal laws, where titles and lands were divided only among male heirs, Margot could not inherit the holdings. This sparked a long, exhausting inheritance dispute, though that was par for the course in Europe at the time, and in 1197, following this dispute, the extensive Bourbon lands passed to Margot's second husband, a certain Guy de Dampierre. It is considered that it is here, on this dramatic note, that the history of the so-called First House of Bourbon ends and the history of the Second House begins. Our journey through the dizzying genealogy of the Bourbons brings us to the grandson of that very Margot and Guy, Count Archambault Ix. While not much is known about the details of his life, the facts speak for themselves. Archambault IX was so influential and famed as a most skilled knight, a true chevalier throughout France, that Countess Blanche of Champagne herself, owner of the richest lands of the early 13th century, made him the lifelong protector of her county. But that's not all. Archambault was appointed Constable of Auvergne by the King of France Philip II Augustus himself. This appointment made our hero, essentially, one of the chief commanders of the entire Kingdom of France. Alas, Archambault did not live to leave male heirs, and tragically died in Cyprus in 1242 during a crusade. The next simply pivotal milestone for the entire House of Bourbon, the marriage of Archambault's granddaughter Beatrice to Robert de Clermont, who was Robert, none other than the sixth son of the French King Louis IX the Saint himself. Thus the young House of Bourbon, young by the standards of centuries-old French aristocracy, found itself bound by blood ties to the ruling Capetian dynasty, and it is upon this fertile ground that one of the most important heroes of our story today emerges. Louis de Bourbon. This outstanding military leader and shrewd diplomat was born in 1279. His father, Robert, Count of Clermont, lost his mind after a terrible fall from a horse in a knightly tournament. Therefore, from 1279 to 1317, the young Louis effectively ruled the county of Clermont, acting as regent. Louis de Bourbon, who was known as Louis de Clermont at the beginning of his career, possessed a truly astonishing knack for making the right moves on the political field. As early as 1297, after being personally knighted by King Philip IV the Fair of France himself, Louis de Clermont demonstrated astonishing military talent and unprecedented valor in campaigns against the Flemish. In the brutal battles of Courtrai and Ferns, despite the disastrous outcome for the French forces, Louis displayed incredible bravery commanding the rearguard. He managed to avoid a massacre and save his soldiers, retreating to the city of Lille in time when it became clear the French defeat was inevitable. And already in 1304, having won several local victories, our hero found himself in the vanguard of the French victorious Battle of Mons and Pevely. After this, the king personally entrusted Louis with several crucial diplomatic missions, including concluding a treaty with the German Emperor, Henry VII himself. As a reward, the young Count of Clermont received the position of Grand Chamberlain of France, a post that would remain with the House of Bourbon for the next 200 years. Can you imagine the scale of the influence? This appointment massively boosted the standing of Louis and his entire family in the kingdom. But that wasn't the limit. In 1311, at the famous Council of Vienne, where the dissolution of the Knights Templar was announced, a new crusade was proclaimed, and our hero was appointed supreme commander of this future expedition. Although the crusade ultimately didn't happen, the formal position as head of the expedition added immense political weight to Louis. After the death of King Philip IV the Fair, Louis made the next correct bet, supporting the regent Philip de Poitiers against the partisan of the young heiress Jeanne of Navarre. And again, success. Philip V became the new king of France, and Louis, only 37 years old, was already entering the Holy of Holies, the Royal Council. Soon after, following the short reign of Philip V, our hero again changed course and sided with the Count of La Marque, the late king's brother. This bet turned out to be even more profitable. In 1322, the Count of La Marque ascended the throne as Charles IV. The new monarch, eager to get his hands on the county of Clermont, offered Louis an incredibly lucrative exchange for other territories, and most importantly, granted Louis the title of Duke of Bourbon. Yes, indeed, this is how Louis de Bourbon became a duke, ascending to the second tier after the king himself in France's intricate feudal hierarchy. After the death of Charles IV, the Duke of Bourbon again supported the favored candidate, Philip de Valois. He ascended the throne as Philip VI, and as a sign of gratitude, returned the county of Clermont to our hero. It was simply a masterclass in political maneuvering, and thus began the 100 Years' War. As early as 1329, Louis paid an important visit to the English King Edward III himself in London as the king's envoy, and in 1338 he actively participated in military campaigns against the English alongside the king. The absolute triumph and final chord in his brilliant career was his participation in the Congress of Arras as France's plenipotentiary representative, where a temporary truce between England and France was concluded. although Louis de Bourbon, nicknamed the Great during his lifetime, is not as widely known today as his more august descendants. His contribution to the aggrandizement of the House of Bourbon is simply impossible to overestimate. It was with this first Duke, Louis, that the name of his dynasty covered itself in incredible glory during the 100 Years' War. The Bourbons built a reputation as some of the most loyal vassals of the crown. Take, for example, Louis's son Peter. In the terrible Battle of Poitiers in 1356, he died shielding King John from enemy blades with his body. His son and heir, Louis II, followed the captured king to England as a hostage, and only returned to France after the signing of the peace treaty. He was also chosen as one of the guardians of the young Dauphin, and John I, the fourth Duke of Bourbon, famed for his chivalrous, refined conduct, was taken prisoner at the Battle of Agincourt and transported to England where he died. This was the peak of influence and power for the Second House of Bourbon. They accumulated power generation after generation, not only through loyal service to the state and blood shed for the king, but also through clever intrigues, minor feudal skirmishes, and exceptionally advantageous dynastic marriages. But such a rapid, dizzying ascent could not last forever. And now Louis XII de Bourbon steps onto the stage, committing a fatal error, violating the main political line of his ancestors. Absolute loyalty to the throne, he enters into conflict with the crowned monarch of France, Francis I of the Valois dynasty, forging a shocking alliance with none other than Emperor Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire himself. The rebellious duke entered into open confrontation with the crown and suffered a crushing defeat. In 1523, Louis was exiled from the country, stripped of all his titles, and his vast duchy of Bourbon was completely annexed to the royal domain. From this moment, our gaze is compelled to shift to a collateral branch of the Bourbon dynasty, to the house that called itself Vendôme. Thus, upon the ruins of the ducal line, the history of the third House of Bourbon begins. The head of this new line, Charles IV, who bore the title Count of Vendôme, had learned the lessons of his fallen relatives well. Unlike the hapless Louis XII, he understood perfectly, you don't bite the hand that has fed your family for the past 400 years. Therefore, he demonstratively sided with the young King Francis I against his rebellious cousin. Furthermore, he actively participated in all of Francis's Italian campaigns, and after the king's capture at Pavia in 1525, who headed the royal council as the first prince of the blood? Charles de Vendôme, of course. Charles's heir, Antoine, inherited not only the lands from his father, but also royal ambitions. By taking the title of Duke of Vendôme, he had formally equaled his fallen, disgraced relatives. Antoine continued his father's work, aiming to strengthen the influence of the House of Vendôme during Europe's highly turbulent times of the Reformation and religious schism. In 1548, he concluded an epoch-making marriage with Jeanne d'Albret, none other than the heiress to the throne of Navarre. Upon his father-in-law's death, Antoine became the heir to very substantial holdings. Besides his native duchy of Vendôme, he received the crown of Navarre and numerous other lands. Foix, Béarn, Armagnac, Périgord. The sheer scale is breathtaking. Despite Antoine being known as a rather flighty and frankly amorous aristocrat, he was marked by astonishing flexibility in matters of religion. While all his supporters and even his own wife Jeanne d'Albret sided with the Protestants, Antoine, not wanting to waste his life fighting the French king, conveniently declared himself a Catholic. This shocking maneuver further solidified his influence, and after several military defeats he added even more lands to his holdings, including the rich capital of Normandy, the city of Rouen, and now at last, it's time to talk about the figure who forever changed the history of France and the House of Bourbon, Henry IV de Bourbon. For France, the 16th century, and especially its second half, was an incredibly difficult, bloody time, a period when the country was shaken for nearly 50 years by incessant religious wars. Little Henri was born in his grandfather's castle in Pau in 1553. From childhood, his soul was torn by contradictions. His mother inclined the future heir towards Protestantism, while his father leaned towards Catholicism. While still a child, his father took him to court, where the young Henri quickly grasped that the real monarch of France was Catherine de' Medici. As early as 1568, Henri, barely out of childhood, took part in the Third War of Religion. just one in the endless series of conflicts that shook all of Europe and served as an ominous prelude to the 30 Years' War. In 1572, upon his father's death, Henri became King of Navarre under the name Henry III. And then an event occurred that was supposed to be the pinnacle of reconciliation, but turned into a real nightmare. Under pressure from the powerful Catherine de' Medici, Henry married the sister of the French King Charles IX, Margaret of Valois, the very one known as Queen Margot. According to Catherine's plan, this marriage was meant to symbolize reconciliation between Catholics and Protestants, as the newlyweds belonged to different confessions. But this all turned out to be a monstrous trap. Just a few festive days later, on August 24th, began the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, mass murders of Huguenots by Catholics, organized by Catherine de' Medici. It was a bloody attempt to ignite the religious war with renewed force. Henry escaped death by a miracle, thanks to his high position and his timely conversion to Catholicism. The young King of Navarre found himself a virtual prisoner at Catherine de' Medici's court, but he didn't give in. Henry joined the so-called conspiracy of the malcontents. The plot failed, and Henry and his supporters were thrown into prison. But then came another miracle. They were pardoned by the new French king, Henry III, Catherine de' Medici's youngest son. After 3 years held captive at court, in 1576, Henry made a daring escape, rejoined his supporters, and reconverted to Protestantism. Despite his escape, he maintained moderate views, trying to steer clear of the most zealous fanatics among both Calvinists and Catholics. Of course, this earned him the hatred of both sides. When Bordeaux, the capital of his territories in Guyenne, slammed its gates shut right in his face due to religious disagreements, he settled in the nearby castle of Nerac, living a rather carefree lifestyle and indulging in gallant love affairs. Nevertheless, after his escape, he actively participated in the 6th and 7th Wars of Religion, where he showed true miracles of humanity, preventing massacre after massacre. Such actions incredibly boosted his popularity among the common people. And then the most incredible thing happened. In 1584, Francis, Duke of Anjou, who was the childless brother of the childless King Henry III, died. And then, thanks to the incredibly convoluted dynastic ties of the highest European aristocracy, our hero, Henry of Navarre, turned out to be the sole descendant of the French King Louis IX the Saint, the very one who had reigned nearly 300 years before our hero was born. How did this happen? It's still a mystery, but it's clear that such a trick was extremely beneficial to someone. Naturally, the Catholic party instantly reared up and flatly refused to recognize a Protestant as heir. Adding fuel to the fire was the death of the Protestant leader, the Prince of Condé, which effectively made Henry the sole leader of all Protestants in France. As a result, our hero became embroiled in a bloody conflict with the powerful Duke of Mayenne, and was even excommunicated by the Pope himself. However, seeing the Catholic League gain strength and its influence spread across the country, Henry of Navarre and the French King Henry III took an unexpected step. They signed a peace treaty and joined forces in the fight against the League. On August 2, 1589, Henry III tragically died from wounds inflicted by a fanatical monk, and on his deathbed, Henry III officially recognized Henry of Navarre as his heir, and so, like a phoenix rising from the ashes, the young Henry de Bourbon ascended the throne of France as Henry IV. This happened on August 3, 1589. But with his coronation, the religious war resumed with double force. The country was exhausted by decades of conflict, and the new monarch seemed to have no strength left to continue the fight. However, after a series of setbacks, the king managed to win several crucial strategic victories. On the battlefield, he unexpectedly revealed a remarkable talent as a commander and the true valor of a warrior. The legendary episode from the Battle of Ivry-le-Bataille on March 14, 1590 went down in history, when Henry, through his heroism, managed to turn the tide of the battle. He led his soldiers into the attack, wearing a helmet with a white plume that was visible from afar. When his troops began to retreat, Henry stopped the fleeing soldiers, shouting the words that became immortal: "If you will not fight, at least watch how I die." Meanwhile, as I already mentioned, the king lacked the resources for a complete military victory. But after several successful clashes with the League's forces, the Catholic alliance arrayed against Henry began to disintegrate. The the monarch seized his chance, using his long-standing connections with the highest French nobility and here and there resorting to good old-fashioned bribery. He managed to persuade all the Catholic leaders to make peace, including his sworn enemy, Charles of Lorraine, Duke of Mayenne, and in France finally peace reigned. Despite the fact that to sign all these peace agreements, the king had to raise taxes by almost 3 times, and even in the future of his reign, the country would cross swords with Spain more than once. Nevertheless, King Henry IV went down in history as Henry the Great and Le Bon Roi Henri, Good King Henry. He made colossal efforts to restore the economy of devastated France after decades of religious wars, and to improve the well-being of the common peasants. After his final return to Catholicism, he was able to consolidate the remaining lands of the French aristocracy around his royal domain. It was during his reign that the final process of eliminating feudal fragmentation was completed, and the formation of French absolutism began. However, like other members of the House of Bourbon, Henry was no stranger to temptations and excesses. A huge number of the king's mistresses are known, from whom many illegitimate children were born. He, like his descendants, craved a luxurious and elegant life. Henry's lost wife, Marie de' Medici, was the daughter of the richest man in Europe, the Tuscan Duke Francesco de' Medici. Their wedding ceremony took place by proxy in Florence, where the king was represented. He agreed to such a marriage for 600,000 gold acres from the Medici banking house, simply an unthinkable sum. Tragically, despite the seeming reconciliation with Catholics and Protestants, good King Henry was murdered by a fanatical Catholic. His son, by Marie de' Medici, Louis XIII de Bourbon, ascended the French throne. From early childhood, Louis XIII grew up a weak and sickly child. Traumatized by his father's horrific murder, the young Dauphin found no parental affection from his mother, Marie de' Medici. He developed a speech impediment and agonizing stutter. Throughout his childhood, Louis suffered from a terrible lack of attention, which made him withdrawn and silent. His mother, Marie de' Medici, immediately declared herself regent after her husband's death. And after her son came of age, she simply declared that Louis was too weak in body and spirit to take on the duties of a monarch. The Queen Regent excluded the king from the council and granted the highest positions and immense powers to her favorites. However, Louis soon showed unexpected resolve. He ordered his mother's favorites executed, and her he sent to Blois Castle under confinement. Marie de' Medici had already begun to gather supporters and troops when the king, at the insistence of his minister, reconciled with his mother and brought her back to court. Louis XIII's entire reign can be characterized by one word: the strengthening of absolutism and the state. From the first years of his reign, the figure of Cardinal Richelieu rapidly gained influence and authority. It was he who would effectively become the most influential politician in France and play a colossal role in the establishment of French hegemony on the European continent. And I must point out that the notion that Louis was merely a puppet in Richelieu's hands is absolutely incorrect. France would spend practically the entire first half of the 17th century embroiled in exhausting religious conflicts, known as the Huguenot Wars. At the same time, the bloody 30 Years' War raged in Europe, in which France played a far from insignificant role. Louis himself was a very withdrawn, gloomy, and, truth be told, petty man. He personally led troops more than once in the fight against the Huguenots and on the fronts of the 30 Years' War against the Habsburgs. But unfortunately he did so with varying success. His only true passion was music and perhaps dancing. He was the author of numerous courtly songs that enjoyed immense popularity in the 17th century. He performed in court ballets more than once and even designed costumes for them himself. Unlike most of his ancestors, Louis was a deeply religious man. Therefore, despite his extremely cool relations with his wife Anne of Austria, he never even contemplated divorce. It is believed that the king had only 2 mistresses in his entire life, with whom, according to rumor, he didn't even engage in intimate relations, although such piety, strangely enough, didn't prevent him, along with Richelieu, from making advantageous agreements with those same Huguenots and participating in the 30 Years' War. On the side of the Protestants, such were the paradoxes of royal power, and so Louis XIII died at 41, leaving behind 2 young heir sons, little Louis Dieudonné, the future King Louis XIV, came into the world in 1638, born of two of the most powerful dynasties in Europe at the time, from his father, Louis XIII de Bourbon, and his mother, Anne of Austria of the Habsburg dynasty. He became king at just 4 years old, and as you've probably guessed, his mother, Anne of Austria, became regent. As a child, the boy was pursued by true ill fate. It seemed as though fate itself had doomed him to an early death. At 5 years old, he nearly drowned in the Palais Royal pond. He suffered through terrifying illnesses like smallpox, typhoid fever, severe food poisoning, and even something resembling a tumor in his chest. All these were illnesses from which even hardier children died individually. But the boy survived and grew stronger. Incidentally, shortly after Louis, his brother Philip was born, who would later become the founder of another influential branch of the House of Bourbon, the House of Orléans. Soon after Louis XIII's death, another bloody civil war erupted in France, known as the Fronde. On one side was the party of the Queen Regent and Cardinal Mazarin, Richelieu's successor. On the other, the so-called aristocratic Fronde, led by the powerful Prince of Condé. However, the war soon fizzled out, bringing no clear victory to either the crown or the aristocrats. Immediately after reaching his majority in 1659, the young monarch made a crucial decision. The war with Spain had already been raging for 24 years, and his marriage to the Spanish Infanta Maria Teresa brought long-awaited peace. An unimaginably lavish ceremony took place on Phasian Island, where Louis first met his future wife, who didn't speak a word of French. After Cardinal Mazarin's death, the king took a revolutionary step. He abolished the post of First Minister and personally took charge of his government. It is considered that it was at this moment that French absolutism was finally shaped. Louis removed from power all the parliaments, and most importantly, the old hereditary aristocracy. He invited the latter to his new residence, where Versailles, formerly a modest hunting lodge, and now the citadel and symbol of Bourbon hedonism, Versailles astonished contemporaries with its luxury and grandeur. This immense palace complex, a prime example of the grand style of French Baroque classicism, included the Grand Trianon, the Petit Trianon, the French pavilion with their theaters, galleries, chapels, and opera house, and complementing it was a colossal garden covering 900 hectares. In this new gilded cage, all the nobility were forced to follow strict etiquette around the clock, regulating every step of court life. This prevented them from plotting against the king. As all noblemen were under constant surveillance by the monarch, it's no wonder that almost all European rulers tried to imitate the French king, often even copying his weaknesses. It was at this moment that Louis XIV's nickname was cemented. The Sun King. Speaking of Louis XIV's hedonism, one cannot fail to mention his openly debauched lifestyle. It's difficult to even count the true number of his mistresses, official favorites, and illegitimate children. Here are just some of the most famous favorites whose names echoed through the court. Louise de la Vallière, a duchess who bore the king 4 children. Françoise de Mortemart, known as the ambitious Marquise de Montespan. She bore Louis 7 illegitimate children. The Duchess de Fontainebleau, Mademoiselle de Soissons, the Marquise de Maintenon. The list goes on and on. Louis ruled the country for 72 years. Of these, he dedicated 54 years to conscious rule. And out of those 54 years, the king dedicated 33 years to war. Under Louis, France acquired the largest and most capable army in Europe, which successfully waged war against Spain, the Netherlands, and numerous German principalities. Territories in the New World were actively explored, first and foremost, in Canada and Louisiana, the colonization of which, incidentally, was started by good King Henry IV. Despite France's cultural superiority over all of Europe and the flourishing of trade, Louis himself remained for contemporaries a cold and despotic ruler, sacrificing the needs of his own people for the sake of his adventurous geopolitical projects. All this dazzling external brilliance ultimately led the country to severe economic decline and impoverishment, absolute, without the slightest opposition. According to the famous Duc de Saint-Simon, Louis destroyed and uprooted every other power or authority in France except those that emanated from him. Any reference to law or right was considered a crime at his court. The king elevated the doctrine of royal rights into a semi-religious dogma. This cult of the Sun King, where capable people were increasingly pushed aside by courtesans and schemers, was bound to inevitably lead to the gradual and relentless decline of the entire edifice of the monarchy, and first and foremost, of the Bourbons themselves. Let's deviate for a couple of minutes from the main branch of the House of Bourbon, which occupied the French throne for almost 300 years, and take a look at other European states where they also, in one way or another, ruled and advanced their interests. As I already mentioned, Louis XIII's marriage to Anne of Austria, daughter of Spanish King Philip III, created a blood tie between the Bourbons and the Spanish Habsburgs. This allowed Louis XIV, after the death of the childless King Charles II of Spain, to make audacious claims to the Spanish throne. Most of Europe, of course, could not possibly allow the consolidation of the resources of two such powerful states in one pair of hands, and thus began the so-called War of the Spanish Succession. A compromise peace agreement, however, did manage to seat Louis XIV's grandson, Duke Philip of Anjou, on the Spanish throne under the regnal name Philip V. It was he who inaugurated the dynasty of the Spanish Bourbons. The Spanish Bourbons ruled Spain until 1808, when Napoleon Bonaparte, as a result of his military campaign, drove out Philip's descendants from the country and bestowed the Spanish crown upon his elder brother, Joseph Bonaparte. But after Napoleon's defeat, the Bourbons were able to make a triumphant return to power and held the crown in their hands until the rise of Francisco Franco and his Phalangists in 1931. And you might be surprised, but after Franco's death, practically with his consent, the monarchy was restored. And today, a member of the House of Bourbon, King Philip VI, continues to hold the title of Spanish monarch. The Spanish Bourbons turned out to be surprisingly more prolific in producing minor branches of their house. Such collateral dynasties are known as the Carlist branch, which even waged war against the main Bourbon line for the Spanish throne, the Isabella branch, the Seville branch, which was a morganatic line. Separately, one should highlight the Sicilian branch of the Bourbons, whose descendants held the thrones of Sicily and Naples from 1816 until the creation of a unified national Italian state in 1861. Let us not forget the small state in northeastern Spain, the Kingdom of Navarre, which has long since vanished from the political map of Europe. As you may recall, Henry IV was initially crowned specifically as King of Navarre. Over the next nearly 300 years, the Bourbon dynasty virtually monopolized the crown of Navarre, and the official title of the French monarch would sound like King of France and Navarre. The Bourbons' double coat of arms would long feature in depictions and seals of the house, until Navarre, after a prolonged dynastic dispute, was definitively divided between France and Spain. Collateral branches of the Bourbons are also known, which at different times held the thrones of the Duchy of Parma and the Duchy of Lucca in Italy, as well as the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg. Returning to France, I specifically want to remind you of the existence of the so-called House of Orléans of the Bourbons. It was essentially founded by none other than the Sun King's own brother Philip, and believe me, it would play its part in France's dramatic history. The House of Orléans was one of the most powerful non-royal dynasties in the country, on par with houses like Condé and Conti, whose heads held the highest titles of princes of the blood. Both these houses were founded by Henry IV's brother, and naturally, they too left a vivid mark on the pages of the House of Bourbon's history. Louis XV, who later received the official moniker, the Beloved, and who became the heir to the Sun King himself, was absolutely not prepared for the monarchical role. At the moment of his birth, he was merely fourth in line to the throne, but fate played a cruel trick on him. In 1711, Louis XIV's only legitimate son, the boy's grandfather, died. The following year, measles claimed the lives of his parents, the Duke and Duchess of Burgundy, and soon after, his elder brother. Louis himself survived solely thanks to his governess, who flatly refused to perform the deep bleedings, fashionable at the time, which had killed his parents. After the death of Louis's uncle, the Duke of Berry, and the renunciation of the French throne by King Philip V of Spain, the fate of the dynasty, so recently numerous and strong, hung by a thread and depended on the life of one small child. For a long time, France was governed for Louis XV by his regents, first his third cousin and Louis XIV's nephew, Philip of Orléans, and then Cardinal Fleury. Both these noblemen proved to be spectacularly incompetent in state affairs. In foreign policy, there was only a mere reaction to the main vectors set by Louis XIV, plus questionable military adventures like the wars of Austrian and Polish succession. The economy was in utter disarray. All privileged classes continued to be exempt from taxes, inconsistent spending cuts followed, and the infamous John Law's financial pyramid, after its collapse in 1720, plunged the country into a crippling economic crisis. Even after beginning his personal reign, Louis XV, following his grandfather's example, did not appoint a first minister, and the monarch's complete lack of any ability to govern the state led to the economic crisis only worsening, with the crown's budget deficit reaching alarming levels, and the failure in the 7 Years' War, where France sided with Austria against England, resulted in the almost complete loss of all colonies in the New World and India to Great Britain. The French navy was virtually annihilated, and France's maritime influence could never again compete with England. Despite this, the king managed to make pathetic attempts to strengthen absolutism, though these attempts, it must be admitted, were dreadful. For example, in his later years, he sent soldiers to all judges with the preposterous demand that they immediately answer the question, do they wish to obey the king's orders? Most replied negatively, and after the dismissal and exile of all dissenters, new courts were established, whose decisions the people refused to recognize. But Louis XV entered history, of course, thanks to his outrageous romantic escapades and complete indulgence of his own base desires. The king himself lived like a true Oriental potentate, submitting in turn to one mistress after another. One of the king's most powerful favorites was Jean Antoinette Poisson, widely known as Marquise or Madame de Pompadour. The king fell completely under her sway for many years, and most political decisions were made only through the Marquise's filter. Her reckless extravagance was literally bankrupting the country before the people's very eyes. Louis XV's last mistress was the former courtesan Jeanne Bécu, who became known as Jeanne du Barry. Her low origins outraged the court and the Dauphin. It's no surprise that the prestige of the monarchy began to fall at a frightful pace. Jeanne, besides her colossal spending on entertainment, meddled in politics, appointing incompetent ministers to high state posts. But the aging king, after several years of solitude, clung desperately to his last mistress and flatly refused to remove her from court. Louis paid absolutely no heed to the growing popular discontent. He was solely occupied with entertainment and hunting. And when, oh horror, the danger threatening the throne and the people's plight were pointed out to him, he would reply with cynical indifference, "The monarchy will last as long as we do," which is to say, after us, the deluge. The king died of smallpox in 1774, rumor had it, contracting it from a young girl sent to him by du Barry. What a poignant and symbolic demise! And so the grandson of Louis XV, Louis Auguste, who received the coronation name Louis XVI, ascended the throne. This was a man without a doubt of a good heart, but alas, of a limited intellect, and an agonizingly irresolute character. His grandfather had kept him away from court due to conflict with du Barry. As Dauphin, he did not receive the most brilliant education, but fortunately he maintained a high moral standard, despite the opulence and vice that surrounded him from childhood. Louis XV's favorite pastimes were hunting and carpentry. It was with the noblest intentions that he ascended the throne, sincerely, wishing to work for the good of the people and eliminate existing abuses. But alas, he lacked the courage to push forward towards a consciously chosen goal. He yielded constantly to the influence of those around him, now his aunts, now his brothers, now his ministers, now the Queen. He reversed decisions he had just made, failed to see reforms through to the end. His famous wife, Marie Antoinette, unlike the king, was accustomed to a lavish lifestyle which placed a heavy burden on the country's disordered finances. Louis's first action was the removal of that very du Barry and the former unpopular ministers. This raised the most radiant hopes among the people, as word of the new monarch's honesty and good intentions quickly spread throughout the country. But alas, his choice of first minister proved disastrous, and such disastrous appointments would plague France right up until the very collapse of the monarchy. Louis inherited a dreadful legacy from his grandfather, but as I said, the strong walls of monarchy and absolutism had already begun to show cracks during the reign of Louis XIV, the Sun King. young Louis XVI found France in the most dire straits. Looking purely at the economic side of the issue, it was a terrible deficit in the treasury. Fierce opposition from the clergy and aristocrats to any attempts to introduce new taxes, the unabating severe economic crisis, and costly foreign ventures, like supporting the North American colonies in their fight for independence from England, all this created a hopeless situation. Louis decided on a desperate measure, to convene the Estates General. His goal was simply one, to jointly find a way out of the crushing debt they had fallen into. But the deputies, weary of decades of inaction and courtly luxury, craved political reform, and meeting resistance from the king, they declared the creation of the National Assembly. Events began to spiral out of control at breakneck speed, an avalanche-like development. After the monarch's failed attempts to forcibly disperse the new revolutionary legislative body in Paris, the Parisians stormed the Bastille. It was 1789, as I mentioned. Louis was known for his inconsistency and vacillation. He joined the revolution, attempting to prevent anarchy in the country, but secretly, he was negotiating with the Austrian Habsburgs with the shocking goal of bringing troops into France and crushing the revolution. In an attempt to secure this alliance with Austria, he fled Paris with his family. But oh horror, he was recognized by a postmaster in the border town of Versailles. At this moment, Louis's authority in the eyes of all France utterly collapsed. He was brought back to Paris, and a trial soon followed. At the trial, the deposed king bore himself with dignity, refused the help of lawyers, and spoke in his own defense. But the Jacobin Club was unyielding. The king was found guilty of treason against the state virtually unanimously. The monarch was sentenced to execution by guillotine. The sentence was carried out on January 21, 1793. Louis's last words on the scaffold were, "I die innocent. I am innocent of the crimes of which I am accused. I tell you this from the scaffold, ready to appear before God, and I forgive all who are responsible for my death." After Louis's execution, Marie Antoinette's turn soon came. Along with her children, she was imprisoned in the grim Temple Castle, an old residence of the Knights Templar. Louis and Marie Antoinette's elder son, named Louis Joseph, was a frail and sickly child, and unfortunately died in the tumultuous year of 1789. The second heir, Louis Charles, was recognized as the rightful king not only by French monarchists, but also by all European monarchies during the Revolutionary Wars. After the liquidation of the Jacobin dictatorship, the Directory regime seriously considered introducing a constitutional monarchy in the country. For the sake of calming the nation and achieving a diplomatic compromise with the enemies of the French Republic, Louis Charles's numerous jailers in the Temple tried to instill a revolutionary mindset in the boy. But, raised as a future king, intelligent, and possessing a strong character, Louis Charles long attempted to resist this pressure. His dialogue with his overseer Simon is famous. "Repeat, you little wolf, our republic is eternal. Nothing is eternal. Only God," the boy replied with dignity. Despite never actually gaining the throne, the monarchists who had formally sworn allegiance to him declared the boy King Louis XVII. Under this name, he entered the tragic history of the House of Bourbon. On June 8, 1795, Louis Charles de Bourbon died in the Temple at the age of just 10 from tuberculosis, a disease that, like a family curse, had claimed many of the boy's ancestors. With him perished the idea of restoring the monarchy in France, at least for the time being. Soon after, the era of the Napoleonic Wars began. Ironically, it was Napoleon Bonaparte who revived monarchy in France, but that was an entirely different story. And after his final abdication in 1814, the event known as the Bourbon Restoration occurred. If we return to the moment of that failed escape attempt by Louis XVI, in fairness, it should be said that he did not flee alone, but with his younger brother named Louis Stanislas Xavier, Count of Provence. His escape was quite successful, and in exile, after wandering through numerous cities and countries over the next 20 years following the start of the Revolution, he was considered the unofficial leader of the French émigré community and head of the surviving French Bourbons. He was strikingly similar to his unfortunate August brother in character. Soft and yielding, inconsistent in action, indecisive, and spiritually weak, However, unlike most émigrés blinded by the past, Louis Stanislas Xavier was distinguished by being capable of learning from past events. He understood a complete return to the past was unthinkable. His time in England convinced him of the compatibility of monarchy with a constitutional system. In 1800, he even sent a naive letter to Consul Bonaparte himself, pleading, "Restore France to its king, and future generations will bless your name." And so, in 1814, after Napoleon's exile, Louis Stanislas Xavier made a triumphant entry into Paris. Russian Emperor Alexander I allowed the future monarch to pass only after he signed a constitutional charter, limiting the power of the French king. This document, intended to be the basis of a new, moderate monarchy, began to be brazenly violated almost from day one soon after. The traditional coronation took place in Reims Cathedral. But Bourbon happiness was short-lived. After Bonaparte landed and his famous 100 Days began, the crowned Louis XVIII fled Paris. He would only return to the capital after the Corsicans' defeat at Waterloo, accompanied by none other than the Duke of Wellington himself. For over a year throughout France, brutal repression and mass executions of former supporters of Napoleon would take place. Louis XVIII had poor health and died childless in 1824. The throne was inherited by his younger brother, Charles Philippe. He was crowned at the age of 67 under the name Charles X and became perhaps arguably the most conservative and reactionary monarch in the entire history of France. Perhaps his views were a sort of defensive reaction to the attitude towards the Bourbon dynasty at that time. Not a trace remained of the glimmer of the royal personages who had once held half of Europe in their hands. The passivity of the later Bourbons, their inability to keep up with the spirit of the times, utterly destroyed their reputation and the people's willingness to give any consideration to their interests. Another ultra-conservative edict by Charles X, issued in the spirit of his adored Louis XIV, sparked a wave of protests that quickly escalated into events known to history as the July Revolution of 1830. The result, another abdication of Charles X and his son, who was formerly King Louis XIX, for a grand total of 20 minutes. The July Revolution of 1830, which so suddenly and bloodily ended the rule of the main branch of the Bourbons, brought to power Louis Philippe, head of that very Orleans branch, the collateral line of the Bourbons we mentioned earlier. He was called the Citizen King, and his reign seemed to unfold according to perfectly bourgeois standards. But as I already said, the age of the Bourbons was long in the past, and the age of stagnation under Louis Philippe proved to be nothing more than fertile ground for a new revolution, the February Revolution of 1848. It was that revolution which finally and irrevocably put an end to the reign of the House of Bourbon on the French throne. Of course, the Bourbons didn't just disappear or die out like dinosaurs. The Spanish Bourbons, in fact, essentially managed to cling to their throne, although they possess no real power now, naturally. The Neapolitan, Parmese, and Sicilian Bourbons lead quite modest lives in provincial European towns today, and their lifestyle is extremely far removed from the dazzling grandeur of their ancestors. It's worth noting that there are currently 3 monarchist movements in France: the Legitimists, the Bonapartists, and the Orleanists. Logically, the Bonapartists see a descendant of Napoleon Bonaparte as the legitimate heir. The Orleanists gasped their vote for the descendants of that very Louis Philippe of Orleans. But the Legitimists, they consider the Bourbons themselves the legitimate monarchs of France. Their claimant is Louis Alphonse de Bourbon, who today could be Louis XX, but Louis himself does not participate in political life, lives in Madrid, and is a successful banker. So what was it that destroyed one of Europe's greatest houses and led to its dramatic fall? Countless expenses and an immeasurable love for luxury, an endless parade of ambitious mistresses and monarchs weak to female charms, or perhaps endless geopolitical projects that drained all resources and drove the common people to despair. All this undoubtedly influenced the fate of the House of Bourbon. However, it seems to me that the main reason was a constant, almost manic drive for absolute power, a desire to cement it in that form forever, completely disregarding the epoch-making changes in society that were happening all around. It was precisely this stubborn unwillingness to change that led to the collapse of this glittering line of monarchs once drowning in splendor and luxury.